All right, before we get started, just a couple of points about what I want to accomplish in this video. We don't just want to learn to match Eddie Jackson's tone and, ape it real quick. We also want to get a couple other things together, and that is learning that, unlike what most people will tell you, you don't have to go out and buy exactly all the gear that this person has, and that's the only way to get it, and, spend a ton of money every time you just want to duplicate a tone. I'm intentionally going to use some gear that is going to give me a good starting place, but then also use stuff that we know for a fact Eddie didn't use, and how I can get that gear to be able to accomplish his tone. As you may know, Eddie's main instrument that he recorded and the tone that most people chase after was when he was using an NS2 from Spector. A big part of the NS2 sound was the original series that had a P and a J EMG set in it. Now, that's a good place to start. And I mean, that's going to get you a huge part of the way there, because that's the essential part to the Spector tone and also to Eddie Jackson and a number of other people who played Spector. So what I'm using in here in this bass is technically a P and J set, but they're in a soap bar format. So this is a P and this is a J. Doesn't look like it, but they're underneath these caps. So I've got that starting place. Not the same exact shape format, but I've got roughly that starting place, but I'm in a totally different bass. So I want to prove that point too, that we can get there with some of the basic essential tools, and getting an EMG PJ set fairly inexpensive, and you can slap it into a number of different basses. It doesn't have to be a Spector. So with that said, let's look at the other gear we're going to use and let's get started. So what we're going to start in with is I have a piece of the isolated bass track from the song Thin Line from the Empire album. Let's go ahead and give that a quick listen and see what we're starting off with. Okay, so it's a pretty aggressive sound, and the first thing I notice is that it sounds compressed. So before I do anything, I'm going to go ahead and put a compressor on here. Got one already kind of dialed in so we can get started. And then I'm going to head over to the bass crunch pedal, and let's see what we're listening to with everything basically set flat, and just do a couple things by ear. So right away, I notice it needs a lot more body and a lot more depth. So let's go ahead and give our bass a tweak here. Make sure we have it on both channels. And I'm also going to add a bit of gain to it. Go ahead and knock the level back a bit. Let's try a bit more on the lows. Actually, let me drop that volume a bit more. Now, I know it's still a little too shallow, but let's go back to our reference tone and see what we have so far. So that chug is really what I'm trying to dial in here. So let's see here. I'm going to bring back a little bit of highs instead of diming the lows. And still feel like it could use a little more gain because it's kind of an aggressive sound. Okay. So at this point, I'd continue dialing it in, and I kind of know where we're going, but what I'm going to do is show you a method to start finding out what parts are missing and what components, and dial in things if you're not used to doing stuff by ear. So let's check this out. This is something from New Gen, but a number of software companies make this. comparative EQs. What we're going to do is we're going to sample the sound of his bass tone, and then we're going to compare it against mine, and we're going to get a graph of what the difference in the frequencies are. So let me make sure everything's off here. Cut off this. And we're going to go ahead and hit match, and we're going to record a snapshot of what his bass sounds like. So let's go ahead and do that. Save that, and now we're going to apply it to a sample of me playing. And I'm generally going to just play in the same range. Okay, then we're going to hit match. So this is what we're looking at. So what you can see is there's some sub-lows here around the 140, 16, all the way up into 160 and 170 area. There's a hump at about 400, 450, a little bit of a valley here, and a little bit of a cut around 3K. So knowing this information, let's go back to the unit and see what we can dial in here. So I'm going to turn on the drive channel to get a bit more grit and some punch to it. And let's see what that sounds like right away. Level, get a little overload there. Now see what this EQ is doing is it's matching me or giving me the same EQ curve. So we're hearing that on top of this. Okay, so that's with the EQ in. That's with it off. So what I'm going to do is bounce back and forth in between the two and try and balance this out as much as possible. So I'm going to add some mids because we have that hump right about here. Now it's starting to sound a little throatier and a bit more like what he has. All right, got our lows boosted here. I'm going to really kick them in because he has a really massive sub-low going on. So already we're starting to get a little closer. So if I don't want to do the rest by ear or I want to check myself, I'm going to go ahead and record a new snapshot. Okay, so now we're looking pretty good in the lows. We've got some cuts here that are pretty big and pretty detailed. And then we've got this upper range. So now we're actually losing a little bit of brilliance. So I'm going to add some of these highs back in. And maybe just a bit more gain. And I'm playing this with a pick where I usually don't play with a pick, but just because it's pretty obvious on this track he is, and you know, we're trying to get as detailed as possible. So I'm going to do one more match. So as you can see, although, you know, we've got some pretty massive humps and cuts here, we are starting to level out from where we first started. So let's hear our bass with the EQ and go back and check out the sample again. And let's go ahead and hear his bass. Okay. getting there. I feel like it still needs some more depth, some more body. I'd probably add in a bit more mids to get this chunk right here. But at this point, we're kind of gain. So now we're getting well into the ballpark. The last adjustments you want to make on this are really to observe what these points are and compensate for them by going back to your amp and dialing them in, or what I'm far more likely to do, which is I'd make an impulse out of this. If you're not familiar with an impulse, I'll have a tutorial coming up on how to do those soon, but look into speaker and cab impulses. There's tons of videos all over YouTube talking about what this is. Basically, it's a sonic snapshot of the sound of a cabinet and kind of imitates it so that you can send it direct out without actually playing through a cabinet. I would probably make a cab impulse and incorporate this EQ into it. Then I'd load it onto an impulse player or one inside here and use that to basically polish up the end of the tone. Now, since we're already talking about AMT gear here, I'd probably go to something like this, like their Pangea unit, a small foot pedal based unit where I can go ahead and drop that in, and that's going to go ahead and load this last EQ along with a cab I might like. But principally, you don't have to use the same gear Eddie Jackson uses, or anybody for that matter, to be able to get this type of tone. It's just creating a back and forth study of it. Most gear has a couple little special elements to it, and then it's mostly how the EQ and tone stack is kind of dialed in. And if you can see that and learn to dial it in yourself, you're going to get that far. But the essential parts, if you look at it, that you can pull from this are his tone has a good jump right here at about 140, 150. Then you've got some mids dialed in at about 450 going into 500. Then you've got some cuts here and here at about 2.8. And all these are going to vary a little bit according to your setup. But if you're using a straight PJ set of EMGs going right out into a pretty good preamp, these are probably the same notches you're going to see. And then he has a really nice presence peak starting up here at about 6. That's where his real edge and cut is coming from. So you have two choices to go after this with once you have this information. You can either go back to here and keep tweaking and dialing in. There's some frequency notch pieces here where I could mess with it a little more and really kind of dial it in, add a bit more gain, which is going to kind of get closer to his really focused, really intelligent and sharp, intelligible and sharp kind of sound. Or I can just do something like this, create an impulse and either use it inside the DAW or load it into a cab simulator here. So you have a couple of different approaches, but it's not that hard to do. After a while, you'll probably get used to doing it by ear, hearing the different frequencies and things. But Eddie Jackson's had a really sought-after tone, and getting in that ballpark or getting a certain flavor of it really isn't that hard. And especially once this gets into a mix, minor differences you're really not going to hear that much. So EMG PJ set, no special preamp, nothing like that. Going into AMT bass crunch, I've got some drive on it, some fairly decent EQ, nothing insane or radical. And that's gotten us most of the way there. A little bit of EQ on top, and that's going to do it. So this is the approach you can use for a lot of different artists and how to start absorbing them into your tone. Now, in part 2 of this that I'm going to do on my Patreon channels, I'm going to take a much deeper dive into this, and we're going to talk about how to start finding consistencies in between sounds that you like and how to start pulling those elements out and adding them into your tone so you're not just copying somebody, you're finding out what it is you like to hear and creating your own original tone. If you'd like to check that part out, my Patreon and Subscribe Star links are down below, and I'd love to see you on that one. It's going to be a cool conversation. So let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know if you've gotten close and what kind of gear you've used to get there. I've heard some guys absolutely nail the tone with the last pieces of gear you would ever think. So with all that said, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it got you closer to Eddie Jackson's tone. It's one that's been chased after for a long time, and for good reason. It's a killer. So that's going to do it for this one. I'll see you on the next one.